This is Professor Rogers. In this video, we look at the use of research questions, propositions, and hypotheses in reporting research findings, such as one might do in a thesis, dissertation, or publication. The reason for making a video on this topic has its origins in my experience. I have found that many professors and research advisors make strong statements about how to organize research. But these statements often are based on their idiosyncratic background and training. In fact, there is much disagreement about the placement of different types of statements in a written document, and at times whether they should be used at all. This video provides a summary of three terms: research question, proposition, and hypothesis, in a way that will help you maneuver the contradictory professional standards that have emerged. As an example, I will use the relationship between crime and poverty. Crime in this case is my dependent variable, and poverty is the independent variable that I use to predict the crime rate or the presence of crime. Our first statement is the research question. There is not a lot of controversy here. The research question is a simple statement that highlights the focus of research. All research has a research question, whether it is quantitative or qualitative, inductive or deductive. In published research, the research question is often not stated directly. It might be disguised as a problem or purpose statement, but it can be easy to figure out even if implied. The research question can become more specific over the course of our research, and it's okay in our writing to reflect the fact that this statement has become more specific over time as familiarity with the literature and data availability increases. For example, I might begin my research asking a question like, what is the cause of crime? At the start of my research, I might have very little familiarity with the literature and be unaware of what data is available or what can be collected to explain the existence of crime. However, as I work through the material, I may come to find an issue about the relationship between poverty and crime that I want to explore in more detail due to a gap in the literature or an untapped data source. It is quite okay to modify my research question as my work gets more specific in its intent. The second statement is what I call the proposition. Here is where some of the confusion begins. When we study the scientific method, this statement is usually referred to as the hypothesis. But as we shall see in the third statement, the use of the term hypothesis has become confounded by the use of the term by statisticians. So we can minimize the confusion by referring to the classic or traditional hypothesis as a proposition. Some people might also call the proposition the theoretical or conceptual hypothesis in order to separate it from the statistical use of the term. Properly defined, the proposition is a simple conditional statement that theoretically or conceptually indicates the relationship between two things. This statement often takes an if-then format. I'm sitting under an apple tree and an apple falls on my head. I might decide to study this act of falling and propose for scientific investigation an if-then statement like the following. If the stem of an apple breaks off its tree branch, then the apple will fall to the ground. If-then logic works well in the natural sciences, but if one frequently reads journals in the social and behavioral sciences, one should notice that if-then statements are less frequent. We do not see many statements like, if the level of poverty is high, then crime is high. If-then statements imply a high degree of association that usually is not present in social behavior. In social and behavioral research, we modify the language to imply a linear association or probabilistic outcomes. Thus, social and behavioral research might use statements like the following. As poverty increases, then crime increases. Crime increases as poverty increases. If the variables are binary, we might accentuate the probabilistic nature of the relationship with the use of phrasing like, as the likelihood of poverty increases, the likelihood of crime increases. The use of the word as and other such words denote the conditional part of the statement, that is, the independent variable. The third statement is also called the hypothesis, hence the confusion with what I just called the proposition. I like to call this statement the Fisher-style hypothesis because of its association with statistician Ronald Fisher. The Fisher-style hypothesis, sometimes called the statistical hypothesis, is actually a pair of statements, the null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis, used in the interpretation of the p-value of parameter estimates. For example, in the study of crime, the null hypothesis would be that there is no relationship between poverty and crime, and the alternative hypothesis would be that there is a relationship. Whether or not the relationship exists, that is, whether or not I accept or reject the null hypothesis, depends on the statistical significance of my results. This format does have some variations. The most important one involves structuring the null and alternative hypotheses to include direction. By direction, I mean that a relationship can be described as positive or negative. In the crime example, the null hypothesis might be that there is no relationship between poverty and crime. The alternative hypothesis would be that there is a positive relationship between poverty and crime. Adding direction requires a change in the use of our statistical test. In the basic form of the hypothesis, where I simply test that there is a relationship without direction, there could be both positive or negative values outside the confidence interval. This kind of test is referred to as the two-sided test. The parameter is regarded as statistically significant if found outside of the confidence interval built around the test value. Many tests of statistical significance reported used in statistical software packages default to two-tailed tests. However, when I add direction, only values on one side of the confidence interval lead to a rejection of the null hypothesis. If I stated a relationship was positive, I would revise my critical alpha to reflect a one-sided test. For example, if I were using a 95% confidence interval, I would ignore the left side of the tail and focus exclusively on the right. My critical alpha of 0.05 would stay the same and fall completely in the right side of the curve. Similarly, I might add a threshold. The idea of a threshold is that sometimes certain things do not appear or are far less likely to appear unless I reach a certain critical mass. Or there might be a point of diminishing return. In the example here, I tied violent crime to communities with at least 1,000 people. There is much debate over how to use propositions and hypotheses. Let me mention two. First, some people have proposed that propositions and hypotheses can be used only with quantitative research and not qualitative research. There are various versions of this argument, and sometimes it is taken to such an extreme that quantitative and qualitative research are regarded as fundamentally incompatible. The extreme argument says that all quantitative research must be positivist, deductive, and thus require a hypothesis, while qualitative research must be exploratory and inductive, and thus no hypothesis should be present. The so-called incompatibility thesis is rooted in a confusion that regards the Fisher-style hypothesis as definitive for all forms of the scientific method. The history of how research got off track on this point deserves more attention than can be given here. But suffice it to say that such a statement would certainly surprise researchers prior to 1980 and would continue to confound contemporary anthropologists who might regard themselves as forming and testing a hypothesis at an excavation site. Second, there is a confusion in quantitative interpretation that stems from the use of the basic form of the Fisher-Style hypothesis. It is seen in students who look only at statistical significance and ignore direction and effect size. In reality, all of these metrics, statistical significance, direction, and effect size, must be considered in quantitative interpretation. The disagreements among professors and research advisors regarding the use of research questions, propositions, and hypotheses often stem from one or both of these two issues. The matter is worsening as the teaching of the incompatibility thesis spreads. How do we manage this mess when we are writing in the social and behavioral sciences? An overriding consideration is the instructions related to the work. Journals often have style sheets, and theses and dissertations often are given a template and/or checklist to which a student at an institution must conform. These constraints should be regarded as overriding in all situations. However, if you have a choice, here is my preference. Also, this is how I usually write when I have a choice. The research question should be stated directly in the introduction or indirectly through how the problem or purpose statements might be written. From my standpoint, the proposition is more important than the Fisher-Style hypothesis because of the importance of the proposition to the scientific method as a whole. And one should place propositions with social scientific variations, implying linearity or probability, at the end of the literature review to highlight the gap in the literature and next logical steps for research. The proposition should be present in the abstract as well. If the Fisher-Style hypothesis is used, it should be placed near the beginning of the methods section. Finally, always frame discussions of results to highlight both propositions and/or Fisher-like statements, whichever kinds of statements you are using. That's the video for today. I hope that you will find this useful, and I wish you smooth sailing as you deal with this somewhat murky landscape. As always, feel free to contact me at my email, rlrogers02@ysu.edu.